Welcome everyone to today's webinar, CIO and CFO Alliance, Digital Transformation Lessons from Geisinger. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. If at any time you don't see your slides moving or have trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We are here to help. With that, I am pleased to welcome today's moderator, Sarah Hickman-Auger, Industry Director, Healthcare Solution of Marketing at Workday. I will now pass the floor over to Sarah to kick us off with some introductions and begin today's discussion.
Thanks so much. I'm Sarah, Healthcare Solution Marketing at Workday, and I'm really excited about today's topic, the CIO and CFO Alliance. We know from speaking with healthcare organizations that big technology decisions and their effects go well beyond IT, and really the crux of success for organizations is to make sure that folks are aligned across departments. And so I'm very excited to be joined by our speakers here today, Tim Fitzgerald, Vice President, Treasury and Financial Systems at Geisinger, and John Kravitz, Head of Healthcare Industry here at Workday. These gentlemen have a history together with digital transformation, and I'm excited for them to share their insights in terms of leadership as well as technology with all of you today. So welcome, Tim and John.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
So we're going to go ahead and start with you, Tim. You have been instrumental in the digital transformation at Geisinger. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role there?
Sure. I'm always surprised when I say this, but I've now been at Geisinger for over 20 years and lead up both our treasury function as well as several of the large processing back-end solutions at Geisinger, payroll and accounts payable. And in those roles, I've become more and more involved with the technology at Geisinger, including running our financial systems division.
Thank you. And sharing just a little bit about Geisinger, I know this will come up in some of your question or some of the discussion that we're going to dig into later. Also, John, so you have a unique perspective as a former provider CIO in addition to having recently joined the Workday healthcare family. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and your current role?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so I had the pleasure of working for Geisinger Health System for 13 years, not quite as long as Tim, but got to know Tim pretty well through that process, and we worked very closely together. I spent a good portion of my career in the healthcare provider side of the business. And I also have been a board member for Chime, which is a CIO organization of about 3,500 members. I did serve as the board chair for Chime, and I'm still in a board capacity with them. But I did have the opportunity to really, work very closely and get involved in all the systems that we've deployed at Geisinger. So we did deploy the Workday HCM, Human Capital Management, which is the HR, payroll, and actually the recruiting talent management component of the system. And so we had always had the intention of going with a full ERP replacement for financials and supply chain and everything else. But that's been part of a broader strategy and a broader cloud strategy for us as a healthcare organization. I've been with Workday for 3 months now. Prior to that, serving 7 years as a corporate CIO for Geisinger of my 13-year tenure. And had the opportunity to really look at the needs of healthcare organizations and my fellow CIOs and how I can advocate on their behalf and provide some information for them on things that we did at Geisinger to really look at how we move the organization forward, how we looked at implementing new technology that can really support and drive efficiencies throughout the organization. So, that's a big part of my job, is advocating on behalf of the CIOs. The other part is really doing a lot of the strategic work for Workday going forward in the healthcare sector. Healthcare is one of our largest sectors for Workday, and it's really an opportunity to develop strategy, both working for product strategy for expanding the portfolio, as well as go-to-market strategy and how we approach things on a national and international basis. So really happy to be part of this team.
We're definitely happy to have you. So I know the majority of the folks in the audience are joining us from healthcare organizations. So I want to start with you, Tim. We know from a market perspective, healthcare organizations have been grappling with ongoing nursing shortages, supply chain disruptions, margin pressures, and now globally we're sort of headed into this macroeconomic downturn. So as a finance leader, what's your perspective on the current situation, and how has that shaped your priorities at Geisinger?
So as a finance officer, we always have the responsibility for the financial sustainability of the organization, and that's something we always take very seriously. But as you've noted, in the past 3 years, it's been heightened all the more by the global pandemic and by the economic conditions. And most health systems are now in a situation where it costs us more to produce a unit of care than we're getting reimbursed for that unit of care. So that's a situation that's not sustainable in the long run. So all of us have a charge at this point to become more efficient. And we can't just turn to our team members and ask them to turn the hamster wheel faster. We have to look for transformation that will reduce cost, increase efficiency, and frequently that transformation is coupled with the IT stack that we deploy. And what we try to do at Geisinger is not simply become more financially sustainable, more efficient, but we're also trying to achieve that level of efficiency in producing the work that the system needs, so that we become more advisory and that my teams are not just producing a paycheck or an accounts payable check, but are helping the clinical and operations teams to understand the expenses and the labor that they're managing. And that's where the partnership between IT and those production departments can be powerful. Sarah?
Sarah, could you repeat that? You were muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So all right. Switching from the finance perspective at a provider organization and thinking about that IT collaboration, as a former CIO, what do you see the role of IT, and how do you support some of the goals that Tim talked about in terms of not just the greater efficiency, but also freeing up time for more strategic support, both from your personal experience and then what you're hearing from other healthcare IT leaders?
Well, I would say primarily speaking, in my most recent tenure as CIO at Geisinger, we looked at, implementing tools and systems that can drive that efficiency that you referenced. We look at our digital environment. We're looking at ways that we can always move to a digital process to improve efficiency for our staff within the organization. Look at utilizing bot type technology to support that staff and take some of the load off of that staff to be able to do other functions, communicating with the customer, whether that's a patient. In Geisinger, it was an integrated delivery. It is an integrated delivery network. So that means it's got a health system, a large health system, large ambulatory system, as well as a relatively large health plan and a medical school. So it's got the education components, research centers, and everything else. So as you might imagine, there's a lot of interaction with customers from any of those perspectives, and primarily patients as customers. So, that's a really important factor for understanding the relationship with the customer or the patient. We want to make sure it's the best experience for the patient at any turn that we have. So Continuous communication with that patient is important. Utilizing technology to support that was very, very important. And that's something that we really strive for. From a technology perspective, we're consistently consolidating systems to drive more efficiency, making it easier for that customer to be able to get access to our services, and then making it easier for our employees to be able to provide a consistent quality service to the customer or to the patient. So to us, that was extremely important moving forward. And we use things like our electronic health record system for that consolidation and our ERP system for back office functions to support that consolidation effort. So those are two that were really, really important for us. And similar to other healthcare systems, we're looking to drive costs out. Some of the stuff that Tim spoke of is really, really important to drive costs out of the organization, specifically looking internal to the IT organization or the information services organization. Really important to drive costs out by rationalizing applications. We tried to go with deeper relationships, and we were successful with that with our core system vendors, our electronic health record vendor, which was Epic Corporation, as well as our back office ERP, which is now Workday. So the more we could do in those core systems, the better we will be, because it's completely integrated information, it's not interfaced information, and it's driving down costs because you get rid of best of breed systems over time. So there is definitely a return on investment that can be seen very easily.
Makes a lot of sense. And I can tell you're still very much keeping that provider perspective in mind. Obviously, you guys are not just coming at this from the IT and finance role. You've worked together personally in those roles at Geisinger for quite some time. So I'm going to ask you to talk about that specific model and what worked well to ensure that the IT teams and the finance teams were always aligned, not just at your leadership level, but across your teams. So why don't we start with you on this one, Tim, from the finance perspective?
So I think what was critical to the success we had was just shared understanding of each other's strategy. So John talked eloquently about what he was trying to achieve as a CIO, particularly think about things like trying to rationalize the total number of applications that always seem to be expanding. And when you think about the things I've spoken about, what the production departments, if you will, the HRs, payrolls, supply chains of the world want to do, what that can lead to at times is the ever more demands for the next IT application, if the strategies aren't aligned. If they are aligned and IT understands where those departments want to go, what's important for them to achieve, and at the same time, the production departments understand what IT is trying to achieve, you can get into a harmonious cycle where there is additional capacity in IT that derives from having less systems, less proliferation of best in breed, and that frees up enough time and resource to implement the strategies that HR, payroll, supply chain want to do. But you can also run into the reverse spiral if you're not well aligned.
That makes a lot of sense. The making sure folks understand not just why you're doing things in an aligned strategy, but sort of the what's in it for me and what the consequence of not being aligned is. John, anything to add from the IT side?
Well, I think the approach that both finance and IT had taken through those processes was to have discussions with their teams, right? To understand the direction, not just set something at the highest level for the organization, setting the strategy, but communicating that strategy and obtaining buy-in from the folks that are in the trenches, so to speak, that are working in the systems day to day. And that's an important factor, because when you consider people are part of the decision to go to a different system, it will impact their jobs. It will impact the way they do their work. Having them involved in the review of the systems, understanding and setting their expectations of what the system needs to do to be effective and efficient at their work, and then having them part of the decision, weighing in on that decision to move to a specific system is important, because then they buy into this process, they buy into the new vendor that's being selected, and they have skin in the game, so to speak. And so, if they're not necessarily happy about it, they might bite their tongue a little bit, because they were part of the decision-making process. It wasn't a decision that was just pushed down from the top. So I think that's really important. And we've seen this at Geisinger. We went first with our HR, payroll, and talent management. And it was a completely different process for, I'll use the example of our payroll people, right? The people that ran payroll, but they were open-minded. They were at the organization a long time, but they were so open-minded, and they accepted and adapted to the change, and they're happier now in the way they do things versus the way they did them before. And I know I'm speaking for Tim's area, but I was closely involved and I was excited about it. So Tim, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that topic.
Yeah, I think you said it well. I think what maybe even surprised us to the positive a little bit was the ability of line level employees to buy into the strategy and have a real stake in the process improvement. And it can be anxiety inducing when you have that level of change for some folks. But when they're part of the change, when they have a voice, it produces a lot less anxiety and a lot more enthusiasm for what's possible. And that I think really was a big factor in achieving what we have.
That makes a lot of sense. The open communication to make sure folks understand not just what we're doing, but why and what's on the other side of it. So Geisinger is a Workday customer. You were both obviously involved in the evaluation and selection process, first for the human capital management solution, and then a couple years later to expand to the full platform for Workday finance and supply chain management. In terms of working together, how did you manage the actual roles and responsibility between finance IT during that evaluation and selection process? It can be a lengthy process, pulling in lots of folks. So Tim, maybe if you could give us your perspective on that, and then we'll go to John.
Well, I think we've touched on some of it, and that is making sure there's buy-in across the organization, higher and line level employees. But I think one key aspect that we didn't talk about is it can't be an IT project. It has to be a project that's owned by the departments that are going to operate the technology and the processes in the future. And that can take some time. You've got to commit the time and the resource, both human and otherwise, to go through the process. Yes, sitting side by side with our IT colleagues, but having the folks that are going to have to both run the system and produce the results, the paychecks, the purchase orders, the accounts payable checks, and having them be at the heart of the decision-making process while being informed by their IT colleagues on the more technical aspects of it, I think was a big part of the success of both the evaluation processes that we went through and the eventual implementation processes.
So making sure those folks in the team who are going to have their hands on the system are involved from the very beginning to understand what's going through. So John, what about your perspective? Any lessons that you learned that you can share with other organizations who are entering into this process right now?
Well, I think it's kind of common knowledge, but I learned this early on in my career, several healthcare systems back. It can't be an IT-driven, as Tim stated, it can't be an IT-driven system implementation. That will never, ever work. The reason being that the people that are the business transformation owners, in this case, the chief human resource officer, the CFO, the chief supply chain officer, people like that, they've got to buy into this solution, meeting the needs and the goals of the organization. And so it's an IT-enabled system implementation. It is not an IT-led system implementation. We've had the best success. As soon as I learned that early on in my career, I never forgot it. And it was something that's been valuable moving forward. And I think, there's opportunities there for others. And I've talked to a lot of CIOs, and they are on that same page. They're very much astute individuals and colleagues that recognize that are moving in that similar direction.
That makes a lot of sense. So is it fair to say that IT is there to maybe vet the technology from a technology perspective, right? That it's fitting in with the overall IT strategy. You mentioned consolidating systems, but then the business users are the ones who are making the determination. Yes, this is going to help me be more efficient. Yes, this is going to help free up my time.
Yeah, and I think just adding a little bit more, part of what our strategy at Geisinger was, and this started about 3 years ago, was that from a technology perspective, strategy was we wanted to go cloud first with our vendors, because our ultimate goal was to migrate our data centers as much as we could to the cloud. And we wanted that for business continuity, resiliency, scalability, ability to change as the business goals change, and add an application that might be really strategic for the organization, and connect that in through our API management platform to be able to enable it quickly and scale up very quickly. It's really, that's something that's not completely accepted by the entire healthcare industry, but I think there is a lot of change moving in that direction. So for us, Workday was a true cloud solution built from the ground up in the cloud back in 2005 is really when the decision was made. And so all the security and everything that's built into Workday is built into the internal workings of the system. It's not bolted on technology, which could fail over time when things are not always upgraded appropriately and integrated appropriately and managed through dashboards and other tools appropriately. So that's something that we looked at very carefully at Geisinger, and that's why we made the holistic decision to move in this direction.
That makes sense. So Tim, from the finance perspective, right, when you sign the check for a project like this, there's some sort of expected ROI, there's some cost benefit analysis. How does that process look in terms of finance and IT and the roles in doing that and staying aligned?
So I think there's a couple things to think about. There's the most classical return on investment, where we're gonna put money down to for technology and even more for the implementation process that's necessary. And so we're looking for a traditional return on investment there. But some of the things that come along with it that are hugely beneficial that might not immediately be apparent. Think about the move to the cloud that John just spoke of. That's a very fortunate outcome of some of the changes we're talking about, the system changes we're making. It's economically good for the system. There's a financial return on that because there's less internal maintenance required, less internal hardware, less internal folks. And it also is freeing up IT capabilities, IT bandwidth, if you will, to support those strategic initiatives that the operating units want to have. And so if the strategy is well communicated, I think the operating units can buy into that as another return on their investment. So I think all those things are important. And the one I think folks miss a lot of times is that, again, what we're trying to do is not just produce the widget or the outcome more efficiently. We're also looking to do that so well that the teams have more time to pick their eyes up, get out of the pure production of a paycheck, and advise their colleagues in operations and clinical areas on what the data means and how they can make smarter decisions. And with that comes a probably bigger return than simply the direct financial numbers that people often calculate.
Yeah, the soft but strategic benefit of freeing folks up from transactional work so they can really partner with the rest of the business to drive those outcomes. That makes a lot of sense. So you guys have touched on this a little bit in terms of how to engage people throughout the process, but it's one thing to think about, oh, this is an exciting project. And it's another thing when you walk in, you're like, oh, well, now we got to use this thing. So how do you drive the adoption to get the kind of benefits that you're counting on that you talked about, Tim, after the solution is in place? Maybe this time we'll start with John and then go back to you, Tim.
Well, I think driving adoption is extremely important. So, the communication is a really important factor for this moving forward. Setting the expectation as you're about to start an implementation process, because there will be a lot of meetings. There are pre-meetings before a system is selected, so you can develop the request for proposal to understand all the system requirements that will be necessary for you to make that change. However, as you get deeper into the system implementation process, and this is nothing new for CIOs or for other specialty groups that have been, business owners to implement a system, but getting the people, coordinated and ready to start their approach, breaking the work down that they'll be accomplishing, having a strong project management approach to that is important as well, and the ability for people to follow a roadmap and plan and to do the work that they need to do in order to, in our case, it's not customized. There is no customization of Workday. It is one package that's out for 9,500 plus companies that utilize Workday around the world. However, there are configuration components to it. So that's what can really differentiate your workflow. And people will get engaged in those processes. And if they're working either directly with Workday for the implementation or working through a global system implementation firm, consulting group, they'll be engaged in that process. Now, I know we've used a GSI, if you will, at Geisinger, which has been very effective for the work that's been going on so far. So I turn it over to Tim and let him just have his comments.
Yeah, I think John hit on one big aspect, and that is really well planning that implementation so it doesn't become mired and more difficult than it needs to be. It's a huge commitment, and sufficient resource, both internal and consulting, are necessary, and you have to approach that pretty soberly and don't under allocate there or you're really setting yourself up for an outcome different than you wish. But I think it starts even before the choice of technology and communicating the why and getting everybody on board on why are we headed here? Why are we changing technology? What's the outcome that we're all excited about? And then keeping that front and center through the communication John mentioned, having a very effective communication plan. And in our installs, both past and current, that has been both owned internally by Geisinger and supported by those consulting resources, and getting everybody both in the departments that are going to use the technology directly, and then even in the for an ERP, really all the employees, if not patients, are going to touch that technology, having everybody understand the why and not sort of view it as some sort of ethereal IT thing that's happening in the background that doesn't affect my life. So that's the whole goal, I think, is to get the why out.
That makes a lot of sense, and I would imagine that's a big part of Geisinger's success is making sure you're pushing down those conversations to the folks who are making the decisions in the business, in the care, and communicating throughout. So, Tim, I know Geisinger is actually in the middle of your Workday project for finance and supply chain right now, but you've been live with HCM for a while. Can you share any of the early value that you've seen coming out of Workday, and maybe why it was so important to follow up with finance and supply chain on the same system?
Yeah, and I don't know that I would have predicted some of these outcomes before we installed Workday, but one of the things that's been most impactful, I think, just focusing on the human capital management, HR and payroll part of the installation first. Those two departments have always had an interaction and have always been materially affected by each other. If we don't get the pay code set up right, we're not going to get the paycheck right. If we don't put the benefit work in right, we're not going to get the employee outcome we want. But those two departments, for instance, they're live now and have been for a couple of years on Workday, have a fundamental change in the way they work together. It's much more seamless. They're much more aware of how each other's interactions or actions impact the other group. And so that's been very useful and I think beneficial for those two groups and for that install. And now if we take the lens and move further out and include what we're installing now and the active work we have going on to add to that platform, finance and supply chain, what has us excited there is the ability to automate fully across a process. Too often in the past, what we did was we automated a piece. We automated the approval of an invoice, but not the order of the item and the payment of the item. Or you could make a similar example in human capital management. But with the completion of the Workday ERP rollout, we're very excited to have processes automated seamlessly, not in buckets, across the entire process. So we think that's going to be very powerful.
That makes a lot of sense, that it isn't just automating each step, it's the broader automation that really gets you the efficiency from that transformed workflow. So let's see. We've been talking about the importance of collaboration within the organization, and communication and all of those things. John, you and I have spoken before. I know you have a perspective that the deep partnership with your core vendors is also a key part of getting the most value out of your system. Anything to add for folks in terms of what they should look for in a vendor or what they should expect, how they can get more out of those vendor partnerships?
Yeah, I would say this, Sarah. The value of a trusted partner, a trusted vendor partner, can't be underscored enough. When I started this process well before our ERP system, while I was the CIO of Geisinger, I looked at our EHR vendor because they continue to expand their portfolio to be able to provide more services that allowed me to get rid of other specialized vendors that were doing work that had to be integrated. And those integrations were sometimes problematic, could result in poor patient care if those interfaces failed for any reason. So, that's one factor that was really important. But I learned to really understand the value that the vendor relationship brings and the communication with that vendor to understand what's on their roadmap. And when we're looking at doing different strategic initiatives for our organization, not that I'm putting all my eggs in that basket, but enough that I can trust them. They've been around for a long time. They've had proven results, and they've got a great customer base. And then we looked at our ERP solution. And that's one of the reasons why I look to make the transition from healthcare CIO to strategy person and support for and leading the healthcare, really the whole healthcare sector for Workday, is because I really believe that Workday is on a similar path and has really been continuing to grow the portfolio of the vendor solution for ERP to really automate so many parts of the process, as Tim talked about, thinking right through the process end to end and how you can automate that, not segments of a process, but the entire process. And that's really what Workday has done. They've done a lot of that. They're doing a lot at Geisinger right now. In the other parts, they've done a lot within human capital management, and that's been demonstrated with great results. Those kinds of relationships are important. And I've got a lot of colleagues out there that I talk to regularly because of my association with Chime and having gotten to know a lot of people. That's one of the things that was pretty evident when I was considering the job and talking privately to some of my colleagues. They're like, you can't go wrong with a company like Workday. It's a solid solution and a lot of good people. And as you get on the inside, you could feel that. And I could tell you that it's really the plan to make sure the customer is satisfied at every turn and to make certain that we can provide new tools for automation and just driving efficiency throughout the organization.
So it sounds like almost you're looking to the vendors to provide the back end of what Tim talked about on the front end, right? I don't just want to automate each individual piece. I want you to see the whole picture, and I want you to give me time to be more strategic. So as you're talking with your vendors about roadmap and what's ahead, making sure that they've taken care of the basics of that automation for you and can talk with you about, well, what's your strategic roadmap? Here's what we're doing, and sort of move that value forward. So let's see, we started the conversation talking about how healthcare organizations are facing significant financial pressures. And that didn't change in the last 35 minutes. So I'll ask, before we open it up to questions, live questions from the audience, do the two of you have any last words of advice for CFOs or CIOs who are wondering, is now the time to invest in an ERP replacement project? Maybe we'll go to you, John, quickly, and then back over to Tim for the in the trenches real life perspective.
Well, I'm going to speak from 3 months ago when I was in the trenches in the real life perspective too. We're all under pressure to reduce costs because the cost of personnel with changes, the globalization of a lot of our positions, not necessarily the clinicians, because they have to be there to treat the patients. I get that. But then there are external costs like, traveling nurses and others that are required because we have a high acuity in our hospitals. We have a high census in those hospitals, and we have to have good quality nursing personnel to be able to take good care of the patients and have quality outcomes. However, there are other areas like support areas, like IT, for example. And with the Great Resignation, lost a lot of people, and it was hard to hire people, and market adjustments had to be made, right, to make up for that. To try to retain people is one of the things. It's one of the components. And, employee engagement and satisfaction is another big factor. However, those costs have escalated a lot. Probably, I think, Tim, to the point of maybe 15, 18% higher than they were pre-pandemic, which really drives, the supply chain costs and everything else has really driven up the cost for healthcare. So with that said, driving efficiency and reducing expense at every angle possible is really important. Now you could be doing nothing, you could be grinding your teeth and wailing about it, or you could do something about it, right? You could look at how you drive efficiency, how you reduce the size of your portfolio of applications, how you can eliminate costs there, and how you can save money for the organization. But it requires some new work, new ways of doing things, and new software that can really be beneficial for that purpose. So that's where a lot of organizations are looking at Workday for their ERP back office solutions, and looking at ways to drive that level of efficiency, whether that is moving some of the processes to the front end in the human resource and talent management piece, where managers can have a function to do that work, request a new position, or refill a position if the organization wants to refill a position, and has the visibility to post a position and do some other things. It's not all just a paper chase anymore, right? Going into the human resource department and have them do all this back office work, clerical work, and then notify somebody that the position's now posted. You have control. The other part of that that's also important is the person that we're trying to attract to the organization through talent management can do it on a mobile device. They can see where they are in the hiring process off a mobile device. And, most people love their mobile devices and they want to work from those and have the flexibility to do things, but still get hired for a job that they really want to have. So those are some examples, and we're going to see that that's just in the human capital management, HR, payroll, and talent management. There are tons of those similar examples for finance and supply chain too. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so it's a great point about having the technology to attract great talent. It's a very competitive labor market for clinicians, certainly. So mobile tools that make anything in their life easier, I can see how that would be important. So so John gave us the perfect view into why it makes sense to replace your legacy ERP, to move to the cloud, all of the benefits that you're going to get long term. At the same time, there's an outlay up front. So Tim, how do you justify this in your organization? Folks who are thinking about, can we really afford to take the jump now, or should we wait a little bit? What would you say to them?
Well, I think most finance professionals, and I think the boards of these health systems also, understand making an investment today for a long-lived return that more than compensates you for that. And when you're talking about impacting the employees of the system, especially now where labor resources so dear, and that's what where one of the big impacts is, it's making labor much more efficient. It's better able to attract labor. There is a real tangible return, and that's something that is worth investing for. And I'd say also that while some of the investment is in the near term, the return on these investments is very long-lived. Most people are making a commitment to an ERP that's going to live for 20 years or so. And so if you can get the right partner and the right technology, and you can accomplish those benefits, they aren't short-term benefits. They're benefits that will accrue to the benefit of your organization for long periods of time and create that return.
That makes a lot of sense. It isn't just about how fast can you get the value. It's that continuing value of being on the right system that can support your strategic goals going forward. So I want to thank you both. This has been a great conversation. You're not off the hook yet. I'm going to open it up to our attendees for some live Q&A using the question function that's probably toward the bottom right of your screen. And I am just going to take a look to see if any questions have come in while we were talking. So I like this one. So we've been talking a lot about the back office enterprise software. What about clinical initiatives, right? We know clinicians are burnt out. Like how do IT and finance get on board together to make changes in some of those clinical systems that are needed? And maybe we'll start with you on that, Tim.
So my first reaction would be, at least at Geisinger, physicians are employees too. And so they're getting impacted by those HR systems. Now, some of it's a little specialized, sometimes with what their needs are from the human resource systems, but that's one way that these systems are certainly impacting the clinicians directly and are therefore useful, and you're getting a lot of benefit to those folks. And then there's a range of other IT systems, certainly John and I have collaborated on over the years to support those folks. And many of the notions about the selection process, the implementation process we've talked about here, apply there as well. And that is getting buy-in from the end users first, making sure they understand the why, and having them support the project, not just have it be an IT or a top-down project.
That's helpful. Anything to add there, John?
Yeah, I would say, the clinical systems, as Tim just stated, we just reinforce this. Before we changed any of the clinical systems to go to our EHR vendor, we had very heavy involvement from leadership and key strategic partners within the business to make sure that they did a thorough evaluation of that system. And in some cases, it wasn't ready yet. So we didn't make that transition because it was better for us to stay on the best of breed system until the maturity factor came into play with our EHR vendor in building out new applications. And that was a continuous process. I would say in the 13 years I was at Geisinger, the momentum picked up near the end. Probably the last 4 or 5 years, we replaced an awful lot of systems and put in our core systems to save time and effort and drive efficiency for clinicians. So one of the things that, give you an example, this will save a tremendous amount of time over the next year or so when it gets implemented at Geisinger, but that is our EICU, patient monitoring system. That right now is in a separate system, and nurses have to tag and do flow sheets and everything else as they're documenting telemetry and other things that are happening with the patient. That will be automated within the core EHR system over time and save a lot of time and effort for clinicians. They'll be able to validate that. Another one is infusion pumps. Being able to electronically order and get results back on the electronic infusion pumps is a tremendous time saver for nursing personnel. All they have to do is verify it's the right medication they're hanging a bag for, and then the communication's happening wirelessly back and forth. Facial recognition for patient identification. I can go on and on and on because I was excited about all these projects. So it was a lot that we did in our tenure.
Lots of opportunities for clinical transformation. So this is another question. We've talked a lot about the alignment and how important that is and getting people involved from the beginning. Tim, do you have examples of specific champions that you aligned with at Geisinger, just in terms of their roles? And then John, the same question for you from other Workday customers who've had successful deployments with Workday.
So I think sometimes it was the leader of the individual unit. So I'm thinking about the human capital management installation and the director of payroll and the director of benefits. And sometimes those are the folks that are the real champions because they have their own visions about what they want to accomplish and how they want to make their departments more efficient. But sometimes it is the lower level troops who are in the trenches every day and having to use an inefficient system and are painfully aware of the inefficiencies built into that system and become really excited and apostles for the improvements because they're excited about how their lives day to day will change when they can be more impactful, which is what they want to do. And so that big change that can be scary to them sometimes is also very exciting to them because they see the opportunity and the ability to do more things that are impactful.
That makes a lot of sense. Any additional champions you can think of, John, from some of our other successful Workday deployments?
Well, it's ironic. I had 3 different customer prospect calls today, which were quite a busy day. It doesn't usually happen that often, but it's ironic because in each of those 3, the CIOs, the COO, the chief supply chain person, the chief financial officer, were in those calls, and each of them were talking about it. And just to Tim's point, have you got engagement of your line level people who work in the system? Because that is extremely important that they have their opportunity to share the work that they do. Because sometimes, as the CIO for an organization, I think I know everything that happens all the way down to the server. I don't. I mean, it's not even possible to understand that. So it's always great to engage people that work in the trenches, as Tim mentioned, and in the process. They understand that so much better. And it helps us to make sure we're making the right decision and then supporting that new decision going forward.
That's great. Thank you. So I have another question for you, Tim. As leaders are looking for transformation to reduce costs, increase efficiency, within a resource-constrained environment, can you talk about some of the key metrics that you've been focused on to track the success there and the value?
So, I mean, some of the things, the KPIs, key performance indicators that we're going to put in and that we use are kind of traditional, but we're quite excited about what we think we can, how we think we can move these with improved technology. So, for instance, in our world, we've always track the amount of goods purchased on purchase orders versus on invoices, with the idea that a purchase order is a much more efficient methodology. But in current technology, we have limitations that we can't exceed, and we have a limit on how far we can move that needle. Now we'll be able to move more and more things. I think in the human capital management world, what we're looking at is how many touches and how many when you think about hiring a person, how much of that can be done in an automated way by the hiring manager, and how much of that takes back office HR intervention and or, gosh forbid, paper and those sort of things. So I think those are some of the things we look at that help us believe that the transformation and the costs are being driven out of the organization.
That's helpful. So another question, I'm not sure who's best to answer this, but you both came in strong saying that this can't be an IT-driven project. It's not going to be successful if that's the case. How involved should IT be during the formal selection process? Like, should it be IT who's creating and releasing the RFP? Is that something that's led more by the business leaders in finance and HR? Do you guys have a perspective on that?
Tim, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think what worked well for us is pre-RFP, getting groups together that are both IT and operational leaders to set the stage, set the process. I would say the operational leaders are the leaders of the RFP process. Sure, they're standing side by side with their IT colleagues. And the way I think of it in the RFP analysis, the detailed work we did to analyze various vendors, was we were working through processes, understanding how processes would transform. And so the operational folks were the folks walking through those processes, but they were collaborating with their IT folks who were keeping them honest about what is possible and what is not possible as you go through that transformation. And the IT folks were helping them understand what the technology could or could not do, but it was the back office, the actual operational people that were viewing and understanding that transformed process.
Okay, so it sounds like the business users saying, you know, this is my dream, and then IT saying, okay, well, let's frame that in terms of what's realistic with the technology today. John, anything to add to that?
No, I really don't. I think Tim was spot on in his response. I think it was good.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's see. This is a pretty specific one. Oh, sorry, I just missed my question. So is Geisinger using any third-party vendors to help drive digital adoption of solutions like Workday or other recently implemented solutions?
When you say third-party vendors, I think I'll answer the question I think you're asking, and that is, no ERP does everything, right? And so while we're trying to drive out best-of-breed systems for efficiency, you're not going to have a situation where you have no boundary technology, no third-party bolt-ons, if you will. Less is better, but you're not going to get to zero. So yes, we have those, and then there's a pretty detailed process evaluating what needs to stay, what can go, and if for those that remain, how do we fully integrate them into the process as seamlessly as possible?
That's helpful.
I'd like to just add one thing, or maybe a couple small points, but I've learned as coming over to Workday is that, you know, when there are initial RFP responses and things that come in and meetings that start to happen with a prospective customer, we have an enterprise architect team that actually will go in and meet with the customer and spend days, if necessary, to be able to evaluate all of those best-of-breed systems that they have. And to Tim's point, some bolt-ons will still be required for like inventory management and some other things. However, they will clearly delineate things that are going to be necessary and things that won't be necessary. So it really helps out the IT CIO and the IT team, and that or provides affirmation that, yes, I believe that system can go, and an expert who knows Workday and knows the environments can help with that. So it's really helpful.
Thank you. So Tim, another question for you, and John, for you during your time there. You talked about how important it is to get everyone involved, particularly the end users. What kind of feedback have you gotten from users at Geisinger in response to the transition to Workday?
So human capital management is live. I would say it was a pretty transformational event for us. The leap in capabilities for the line level employee, not somebody in HR, in payroll, but for the nurse on the floor or the EVS worker, they were able to get a system that meets their needs much better. And I think that was realized by the line level employee quite a bit, and there was quite a bit of affirmation for that. back in HR, payroll, the folks that are using the system in that way to produce the outcomes, I think, again, the biggest change there was the seamlessness and the visibility across the processes that drew the departments together that was the most transformational.
That's great. You know, we talk so much about the frontline worker and how important it is to serve those clinicians, the EVS workers, folks who have the direct patient interaction. So that's great to hear that their needs are being met. Let's see. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This one's about change management, and I know you guys have spoken at length about this in other conversations. Do you have any specific advice about the change management methods that have been the most effective at driving Workday adoption? Tim, specifically at Geisinger, and then John, you know, sort of from a best practice perspective at other successful deployments.
So I think particularly on our what went well in our Workday human capital management implementation and the organizational change management around that. And what we're planning now as we move further into the implementation of supply chain and finance is lots of continuous targeted communication, multiple times, often and early, and multiple channels. So we're not going to go live for a year yet, in round numbers, with finance and supply chain, but lots of communication coming out now. There has to be a level of awareness for folks that can't be developed over a 2-week period right before go live. And not only is it voluminous in that it's a long period of time, and we're using different channels. Now we have an advantage. We're already highly digitized at Geisinger. It's the way we communicate with our employees effectively. It also has to go, I think, from senior leadership and a different message there, then to the line level employee that needs that information, but needs it for a different reason and needs it displayed in a different way.
That's helpful. Anything to add there, John?
Actually, not much. I think what the point is, you know, with leadership supporting these new systems going forward, and that communication continuously down to the team, progress reports for the team, you know, to give them updates on where they are in the process for system implementation is extremely important. And just, you know, overall, you know, results, right? Change management, though, is so mission critical. And really with Workday, change management and governance is extremely important because you're working with one database that is used everywhere, and changes to that. It's not like it was in the old days where you had these downstream subsidiary systems. And I'll use an example of, you know, HR can be separate from payroll but interface together, right? And so if you made a change, you're only going to really impact your one area. Well, that is no longer the case. So governance and change management is mission critical when you put in a truly integrated state-of-the-art system like this. And so that's one of the conversations that I've had very frequently with CIOs and with the business leaders, is that you need to establish a solid, and we help them with that. We can help them to establish that appropriately, but it needs to be adhered to, and it might seem very strict, and it can be loosened up over time as people become more familiar with the functionality, but a change on one side can have a negative impact on a change on the other side. So we have to be very careful about that.
Well, and I know we've spoken about some of our most successful customers. They really concentrated on how do we keep this governance process moving forward after deployment, not just in the implementation, but like this is our new way of managing the system. So we're in our last minute. I have a dozen questions we didn't get to. I apologize. We will get that information from Becker's, and I'll do my best to connect with Tim and John to get answers out to folks. Thank you again, both of you, Tim Fitzgerald from Geisinger, John Kravitz from Workday. Excellent insights, and I'm going to turn it back over to our friends at Becker's for any last-minute housekeeping announcements.
Thank you, Sarah. That is all the time we have for today. So I want to thank you, Sarah, Tim, and John for an excellent presentation, and Workday for sponsoring today's webinar. To learn more about the content presented today, please check out the resources section on your webinar console and fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.